come before you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. In the beginning, there was nothing. And God said, "Let there be light." There was still nothing, but now you could see it. Favorite joke of mine about this first verses of Genesis, probably this rather long reading from Genesis caught some of you off guard. You know, it's something about preparing oneself to hear something that's longer than normal. We're accustomed to readings of a certain length in church. Now, maybe if you looked ahead a bit, you realize that the lectionary did in fact balance out that very long reading in Genesis, and you're maybe even concerned about the equity among our readers and the opportunity they have word for word, which I assure you comes out in the wash later. But the reality is this very long reading from Genesis is a very important part of our story, something that you probably already know. But furthermore, I would suggest to you that this very long reading from Genesis is indeed an important, even critical aspect as we gather to celebrate what is known as Trinity Sunday. So if always the Sunday that follows Pentecost is Trinity Sunday. And some might speculate that they try to land it at the beginning of summer because some have already left for their vacations before the clergy try to explain the Trinity and goof up everybody's theology.
Yep.
And I'll remind you that there's probably a very good reason that the creed follows the sermon. That is to say that it corrects whatever heresies the preacher might commit over the course of the sermon, and indeed is an affirmation of various aspects of our understanding of a Trinitarian God. And I'll remind to you also that in the last couple of years, it may have happened that Father Ernie was in fact preaching on this particular Sunday, because it's customary for rectors to always assign it to any other preacher who might be available, rather than talk about the Trinity themselves and reveal their personal heresies before their congregation. And indeed, while he's vested and here among us, I did not assign this to Father Ernie. And I spared Mother Marcy, which she said she was very grateful, having spent the last week on retreat. She said, "I'm glad you didn't ask me to preach on Trinity Sunday." I said, "Yeah, that would have probably ruined your entire retreat." And she said, "It might have." You know, just the notion of trying to prepare for this. And so we begin. You know, we have the reading from Genesis, which I'll get to momentarily, but first I'll say that the lectionary is clever only insofar as it offered us two other readings that marked the occasion by saying Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? I mean, this closing passage in 2 Corinthians by Paul, he's closing out in this very Trinitarian formula. And while I'm not one to often speculate about the authors of the Gospels and what they carry forward to us from what Jesus said to them, I am a little reluctant to believe that even the resurrected Christ, as he commissioned his disciples, actually said, "Baptize people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." It sounds a little too convenient. I think it may have been injected later. That's not to say that it's not helpful. But what I think is a lot more likely is that Jesus made sure that they understood that they were to go out baptizing, marking people as God's own. And when he suggests that to them, I am confident that Jesus probably went on at some length to try to instill in the disciples the notion that they were supposed to carry forward the very story of God, the very thing that they grew to understand through their time with Jesus. The entirety of the story of the understanding of God that they carry forward to the world is critical, and that they mark people as God's own in that story and make that story theirs, not just reserving it for those who may have in prior generations been considered God's people, but to everybody in every nation, in every place. Because this story matters and it changes lives and it transforms people. So I am sure that while the words that maybe came out of Jesus' mouth might not have included Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I'm confident that he wanted to be sure that his disciples carried forward the story of God. Which is why I think it's so very important that we have even a very long reading from Genesis on this, Trinity Sunday. Because I think it's in this very long reading in Genesis that we see an early explanation of the entirety of God. Now, you may have noticed lately as I've been preaching, part of what I've tried to offer in most cases is a bit of context, a bit of what surrounds the readings, because I think often that does help us to understand what's taking place in the reading itself. And so what I'd like to do before I talk too much about Genesis is tell you about the verses just before it. Okay, so there's not actually verses just before it. We started with Genesis 1:1 in the beginning, right? But indeed, there is context before it. Because before Genesis came into being, before the words of Genesis were written down, before they were even offered up into the world in a verbal tradition, there was an understanding of God in the world. And indeed, in our ancient history, what we find is often that God was not singular, that God was multi-layered, and probably, there was a God of this people and a God of that people, because there's clearly difference in these two sections right here, and a different God for those folks over there, perhaps, but certainly also a God for this mountain or that mountain, a God of this altar or of that sea or of this animal or of that being. And so, when we read this story in Genesis of a God who created everything that is, it is a radical change to what our understanding, a collective understanding, a human understanding of what God is, a singular God. And so it needs to be spelled out very deliberately, word by word, thing by thing, everything that God has created. It's important that in Genesis we begin with a formless void so that it's very abundantly clear to all who would listen and hear this message that even the very ground that we stand on is made by God, that the sky above and the air that we breathe is made by God, that the mountains were formed by God, that the seas were filled by God, that the creatures in each of these places were each created by God. And I love the fact that as you read through it, at each thing that God creates, God pauses to see that it is good. Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes life makes it challenging to remember that, right? God pauses after creating each thing to acknowledge its inherent goodness. What a beautiful creation we live in. And what strikes me is that this God of all creation pauses to acknowledge the goodness in this creation. And then lest we be left out on Trinity Sunday, we make sure that the verses of Genesis even reads, let us make humans in our image. Just a little, it's what do you call that? Foreshadowing? For the Gospels that'll come much, much later. What do you call this? Just a little bit of a hint or a glimmer of what's to come, to make sure that even as we acknowledge that there is oneness in God and that one God created all of these things and aspects that are named specifically in Genesis, still there's this glimmer that there's this complexity to God that we'll never quite understand. And it's what makes us nervous as preachers as we talk on Trinity Sunday. And we're made in God's image, which sometimes we distort as we try to describe God and begin to make God in our image, because our image is what we know and understand best. So rather than reflecting on how we're made in God's image, sometimes we apply our characteristics to God. So we must be careful, and we must remember that God is so much larger than even what we can ask or imagine. And the allusion in this story, as it unfolds in Genesis and the magnitude of creation, may serve to remind us how vast God is, and that we are an honored part of God's creation. We are honored in being made in God's image and being creative beings, not pawns in God's creation, but a part of it, because we've been allowed to participate in the very act of creation itself, and that's why creation continues to move and change its shape and being as we continue to allow God to be reflected through our lives and through our actions. And so, on this Trinity Sunday, I urge you to not look to doctrine and dogma to define the God we gather to honor, to glorify, to worship this day, but to remember the stories of how God has moved in creation and how we get absorbed up into this thing of God and reflect it back to the world. And I think that's the story that the gospel proclaims, that we are a part of this creation, that we've been gifted with the Holy Spirit, that it might flow through us as we interact with the world around us, and that we might indeed be known by God's love, which has absorbed us and flows through us. It's a little like this. Now, I don't know about you, I love music, and I know many of you do too. I know because many of you have shared some of your favorite songs or your favorite artists, or the things that you just have to, you put on repeat and listen to over and over again. And we're blessed with a great choir that honors our worship here in that need for music and how music honors and glorifies God. But I'll tell you this, when I've asked people about their favorite song, when I've asked them to share with me a bit about it, they never say things like, well, it's got a 4/4 timing, and it's in the key of C, and it's got a lot of notes, quarter notes, whole notes, half notes, a fair number of each. No. That's not how you describe your favorite song. Is that how you describe it? Nobody's ever described their favorite song. You say, it moves my soul, right? You say, it's got groove, it's got drive, it's got funk, it's got this capacity to make my heart come alive. Are you with me? Yes. When you talk about your favorite song, you don't talk about what key signature it's in. I'm sorry, Mark. It's just true. We just don't. It's not how we describe our favorite songs. And so when we talk about God, while doctrine and dogma might be helpful at times, while crossing ourselves in the simplicity of offering the words Father, Son, and Holy Spirit might be good reminders of all the various ways we've seen God move and breathe and exist in this world around us. But I hope that we don't neglect to share how God has moved in our own lives, and let our own lives be the story that speaks truth to the description of the God who was and is yet to be. Amen.